Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the OnePlus 8T and see how the specific phone holds up in 2023. Now, what's funny is I've always liked the OnePlus 8T. For some reason, this phone always stood out to me. I'm not even too sure why. It was a pretty good phone when it first came out. It was coming off the heels of the OnePlus 8, which was a pretty massive change for the OnePlus phones in general. And I was really happy about the OnePlus 8. And with the OnePlus 8T, I think this was a pretty good phone too. Now, if you want to pick up some phones that I would recommend buying this year, the links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the OnePlus 8T, you are getting a beautiful design on the front at the very least. It's a 6.55-inch Fluid AMOLED display. It's 1080p and it was a really good panel. I enjoy this panel a lot, and I still think for the most part, if you were getting a phone like this, it still looks very good. Of course things have changed, but I will look at a phone like the OnePlus 8T, and I think OnePlus did a tremendous job with this type of device. Is it perfect? Clearly not. There's clearly some issues that I've had with this phone overall, but I think the front of this thing looks great. It also has a 120Hz panel on the front of this phone too, which that in and of itself is a really, really nice touch as well. You are also getting that hole punch display too, so there's a very little amount of bezel on it, and that's just another cool thing going on with this type of device as well. So on the front, I always enjoyed it. Now on the bottom, you are getting that USB Type-C port on this thing, which is great. You don't have a micro SD card slot. You do not have a headphone jack on this phone either. Most phones do not have headphone jacks, but it is what it is. There's not much we can do about it nowadays. Now on top of that, we are getting the frosted glass back on this phone, which I've talked about a lot. I've always loved frosted glass backs, and having that type of capability on this phone is really awesome. It blends in very nicely with all the modern phones we have nowadays. So if this thing had that standard glass back that was on like the OnePlus 7 Pro, I think that would make this phone age not as good. But considering that the OnePlus 8 also had a frosted glass back, I think that stands this phone pretty well. Like when you compare it against the latest generation, it actually holds up fairly well against those specific phones. So at least on the outside, this phone looks very good. You had that camera setup on the back as well, which was very cool. There wasn't really a lot to complain about with this phone during that time. And I think when it comes down to it, this phone still looks very good. It still performs fairly decent as well. Again, it could probably have been a little bit better during its time, but I think this phone holds up very, very well in this day and age. Now in the camera department, it's a little bit complicated, but for the most part, this phone on the back had kind of like a quadruple camera setup. Now, was it really quadruple cameras? Not really. It was a 48 megapixel wide angle lens, a 16 megapixel ultra wide camera. Those are the two most important cameras here. Then we get a 5 megapixel macro lens and then a 2 megapixel monochrome camera. So those two last cameras I mentioned, very, very unnecessary cameras for the most part. I think for a lot of people, you will probably never use cameras like that in general. So they just kind of throw those cameras in there so it makes it look like it's a multiple camera setup, even though it's not really quite the case, to be honest. So in this case, with a phone like the OnePlus 8T, the camera on the back, it was very, very average. I was really happy they threw an ultra-wide camera here. The front camera was 16 megapixels, so honestly the front camera really wasn't that bad, but you were getting 1080p on the front of this camera, and on the back you were getting 4K at 60. Now the back is totally fine, right? 4K at 60 during 2020 was totally fine, but the issue that I have with the front camera is that 16 megapixels at 1080p, the front cameras on the OnePlus phones have never really been that great, and even now they're still not even that great, to be honest. I feel like OnePlus could be doing a much better job on their camera side, and they still, even with the OnePlus 11, like 3 years or 2 years after this phone's release, it's still not even that great. So if there's one area that I could really wish, OnePlus to kind of improve on, it would definitely be the camera. And this is probably one of the weirder aspects of this phone. It's not that great of a camera. It's probably what we kind of expect at this point. But if you do want to get a phone that has a better camera, you can always go for the Google Pixels, the iPhones or Androids of those years. But this phone, I'm just not a fan of the camera, if I'm being honest. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of the software and the longevity, this phone is still supported with software. It's probably going to be supported for the next year or two. It's definitely not going to last as long as probably the Google Pixel of that year, especially the iPhones of that year. But this phone's still going to be supported for quite a bit of time. Well, not quite a bit of time. It's still going to be supported, for probably a little bit of time after this, video is made. But I think that's great. This phone software Could have been better. It's definitely not the worst experience you'd ever have with, a version of software, but it is more skin than what you probably have, expected before. If you remember this phone, probably like 2 years after this phone's release, or maybe a year after, it ended up merging with Color OS and it made its own Oxygen OS like hybrid. I was not a fan of this new hybrid, software that they made. It was good when the OnePlus AT initially released, but then shortly after it started being this weird version of software, and I really don't think anybody really liked it. So it's kind of weird too, because the phone looks so beautiful, but then the software is just so clunky and weird. I don't really know what's going on with it, but in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now from the performance side, this phone internally has that Qualcomm Snapdragon 865 chipset inside, and it had 8GB of RAM on the base model, but it did go up to 12GB of RAM. Now that is a lot of RAM to have on a phone like this. If you think about it, for a lot of phones they still are pretty much at the same caliber. They have the same type, same amount of RAM for the most part. So it's not like we're missing out on too much there either. But I will tell you that 865 is still a pretty good chipset. That was pretty much the same chipset on all of the phones that came out that year. So if you think about it, this phone, in terms of the performance, had the same hardware as a lot of other phones that already came out that year. So I think that's cool when you're getting a phone like this. You're not really missing out on like a whole lot, so that's always something nice to kind of see here. But I will also say that with a phone like the OnePlus AT, performance is going to be okay. It's going to be good. For how old this phone is, I think it's actually going to be probably better than you'd expect. But this phone is already approaching almost 3 years old this year. With any phone that gets this old, there's always going to be issues. There's always going to be random glitches, and you can't really avoid those things. It's just how phones age. So in this example, you're really not going to be getting the best performing phone of that time. It's definitely not going to be like amazing. It's going to be good. It's going to give you good quality. It's fairly smooth, and with a 120Hz panel, that's always been really nice. Having a 120Hz screen just right there with all the applications that you can use is always so nice, because it just makes things feel so much smoother. I feel like the software is kind of the clunky thing here, to be honest, but I think for the most part, if you're still playing games, if you're still doing, heavy intensive applications, you should be good to go. But keep in mind that with the older chipset like the 865 chipset, since like the 888 chipset, a lot of chipsets, like a lot of the power has been improved quite a bit. So just keep that in mind, but I think you'll probably be okay with this type of phone, to be honest. Now this phone had a massive 4500 mAh battery too, which was honestly very big, and you were getting pretty good battery life from this type of phone. I mean, if you think about it, the S23 Ultra I think has like a 5000 mAh battery or something like that. So this isn't even that far off from that phone, and this one came out like 3 years ago. So to kind of sum up the whole video, what I'll tell you is, I definitely do think a phone like the OnePlus AT, it's not the first phone I would recommend people to buy anymore. I think it was quite popular and quite important when it first came out, but since then the software's kind of taken a toll. Like, so many things have been a little weird with this phone, and it just kind of puts this phone in a weird situation. If I were you, I probably wouldn't recommend buying the OnePlus AT as your first phone. If you want, I would recommend buying like the Google Pixel 6a. I think that is a pretty good phone. Maybe not as quite comparable as to this thing. I think a Google Pixel 6, if you want to save a little bit of money, that is a really, really good phone. The Pixel 7 is the latest one. That makes a lot of sense. The Samsung Galaxy S21, I think, is a really good phone that's very powerful. Has amazing cameras, amazing display, good enough display for the most part as well. Those are the type of phones I'd recommend buying. If you want a phone this size, the Galaxy S21 Plus is a no-brainer. That is a very, very good phone. But with the OnePlus AT, I don't know. There's nothing really anymore that sparks me of this phone. It doesn't really like get me hyped up. It's a good phone, I guess, but the software just has taken a toll on me, to be honest. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.